Thank you all for coming. I'm real glad to be here and to be doing this. It's kind of a hard act to follow Jen. I was watching her PowerPoint and looking at her extensive uses of pictures and imagery and thought, my God, I don't do that at all. So I'm going to bombard you with lots and lots of text and talk really, really fast and hope you listen. Our topic here for today, this presentation is resume writing, essentially. I know that you're all in grad school, but you're in all different ranges of grad school. I know we've got first years here. I know we've got postdocs here. So some of you are probably going to be a lot more familiar with a standard academic CV than others. But we're going to take that academic CV as kind of our place to start from today and think about, well, how can we work with that CV and turn it into a resume? And if you're a person who already has a CV, then you've got a lot of this work already done. It's sort of transferring. But I've tried to make the talk work so that even if you don't have a CV and you're just thinking about how do I get started on my resume, that it'll work here for that as well. So this is what we're going to go over. I'm also not going to assume that everybody knows exactly what a resume and a CV is, so we're going to hit that real quick, and then we're going to move on to the turning your CV into a resume. We're going to touch on transferable skills, like Jen already did, a little bit. Then we're going to talk about some of those other elements of a good resume, like the bullet points and the organization that are going to be part of it. So partly the reason that I want to start talking about what a CV is because a lot of times there's differences in terminology. In the United States, in American English, there's a difference between a CV and a resume, but those differences kind of collapse in other parts of the world. So some places might just call it a CV, and that's both. It's the same thing. It's the one document that you use. So starting with the CV. And here we're talking about a pretty standard, straightforward academic CV. And the key thing to keep in mind about an academic CV is that it focuses on your academic credentials. So if you look at a CV, it reads like a list of the stuff the person has done in academia. So in that regard, it's a little bit retrospective, right? This is the stuff that you've already done. And this makes a lot of sense if you also consider who the typical audience for a CV is and what the purpose of a CV is. You use a CV to apply for an academic job, right? Or maybe a government research job, or maybe for a fellowship, but something that's really related to academia. So the people who are going to read that CV are going to be other people in academia. They're going to be other people with PhDs in your field and probably your subfield. So when you point out to them your academic credentials, it makes perfect sense to them because they have those same credentials. They did those same things. They know what that means, right? So it works really, really well for that because you're applying for something in a particular area to people who know about the stuff you've already done, and it's in that same area. So the CV is going to include all of your relevant work and experience, but relevant here is just going to mean academic work. And it's going to be fairly rigid in content. CVs aren't real creative. There's a little bit of variability. You can adjust them a little bit, but they're pretty regulated in how they go, and it varies by discipline or by field. And they can be long. I was looking at one a couple days ago from a doctor, academic at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, and it was like in the mid-50s pages long. And it's like, whew, geez, we had like 2 pages of books. So it was enormous. Yours, most of you probably won't be quite so long, maybe 3-4 pages long. But a lot of times that feels pretty long when you're writing it. So compare that idea to the CV. And again, if we sort of know what a CV is for and how it works, and know what a resume is for and how it works, it'll help you make good decisions about which one to write and how to go about writing it. So resumes are focused on skills and experience. Skills and experience are what go into your resume. They're very forward-looking. They're about how can I bring what I've done before and apply it to this new job, this new thing that you want me to do for you. All right? So they're very evidence-driven. They use examples. They use quantification. They're selective because they're short. CV can be your entire list of everything. Resume is going to be short and selective. It's going to be your best stuff. There's a lot more flexibility in a resume. You can organize them in lots of different styles, lots of different formats and ways of putting in content. And they're also targeted. So because the CV format is a little more rigid, it's hard to target it for particular jobs a whole lot. You can make adjustments, but you can't do a whole lot of targeting. Resumes, you're going to want probably to adjust it for every job for which you apply. And they're short. 1 page, 2 pages, maybe. The sort of rule in business is if you've had a job for 10 years, then you can do a 2-page one. Other than that, it's 1 page. So if you've got a PhD, you're kind of right on the, maybe it's a 1-page, maybe it's a 2-page. And my sort of advice on that is generally pay attention to the job ad. How many things do they want? How many of those things do you have? Can you talk about those things so much that you need a couple of pages? Then do 2. And if we think about the audience for a second for a resume, you're giving a resume not to fellow academics who do the same thing you do. You're giving it to somebody in a business that's maybe related to, but not that closely related to what you've been doing. They won't know the significance of having like 6 publications in a refereed journal. They'll go, so what, this guy writes articles? You know, what she goes to lots of conferences? What, I don't know why that's important. Because that's not what they do. So part of what you have to do in your resume is explain that, and explain the importance of that, and the way you do that is by focusing on your skills. All right? So, yikes, 1 page, short, ouch. Yeah, it is. But everybody who reads a resume knows this, right? It's not like everybody else's resume has everything they've ever done and you're the only person who had to cut, right? Everybody's is cut. Everybody's is abbreviated so that it's what's expected. And along with what I was just saying, they might not care about your PhD very much. I mean, they'll understand that that's an important degree, but they won't know what it entailed. They won't know why it's important. So they don't need you to tell them, they don't need you to talk a whole lot about it because that's not what they're interested in. They're interested in, what are you going to come here and do for my company, right? So a lot of that stuff just won't matter. All right? So types and styles. I said already that there are lots of different formats for resumes, but there's no particular format for a particular job. Like you don't use this one for science jobs and this one for humanities jobs or anything like that. There's lots of different formats. You need to choose the one that works best for you. And like I said, you'll be adapting it for every job. Adapting, not rewriting it from scratch. But you'll probably a good idea to have several different versions depending on the types of jobs you're applying for. When I talk about CVs here today, I've been trying to say academic CV. And I might not have said that every time, but there are some different sorts. So if you are applying for a government job, for instance, or a job in industry where you're going to be doing sort of PhD level research in your field, in your special field, then you might be doing using what's called an industry CV, and that's kind of a hybrid, and they're hard to talk about because they all kind of look a little bit different. But the idea is that it'll incorporate some elements of a resume and some elements of a traditional CV. So it will have your publications on it because that'll be important to somebody who's hiring you to be that sort of researcher in your presentations. But it will also have your skills because they will not be hiring you probably just to be a researcher, but they'll be hiring you to do a particular job that involves some research. So you'll want to be able to be forward-looking and say, what am I bringing to this job in particular? So it's kind of a hybrid. So you can either think of it as like a CV with bullet points or a resume with publications. It's a little more complicated than that, and it's hard to explain. But as you start to think about what a CV looks like and what a resume looks like, and start thinking about job ads and what would impress them, what would be important to somebody who's hiring for that position, that can give you a good clue about which sorts of things to put on. All right. So There are some similarities. There are some sections that are typically in both. This probably won't surprise you. Your header, contact information, education. In certain fields, there might be licenses and certifications. So we've worked with quite a few nurses over in the Grad Success office. And nurses, it probably won't surprise any of you. It surprised me a little bit at first. Nurses are serious about nursing. So when they have, even on their, like, their academic CVs, they've got a section for, like, certifications, right? They want to state and are proud to state, you know, that they are, you know, whatever registered nurses, and that they have those sort of actual nursing credentials. But, you know, if you're in philosophy, there isn't that same sort of licensure process. So it wouldn't be on there. So, but that would be on a nurse CV, on a nurse resume, either one. Relevant work experience, keeping in mind that the relevant in a CV is just academic jobs. Even if you've had really cool jobs outside of academia, they're probably not going to get onto your academic CV for the most part, with a few exceptions. If we'll talk about art history again, since Jen was. If you are in art history and you worked at a museum, say, that would be pretty relevant. But other than like some few special cases like that, not going to be on there. So, was I talking about that? Okay, sections typically in both. Sections typically in the CV, but not the resume. Again, these are like what your academic credentials would be. Your publications, your presentations. Teaching would be in your CV as a section. Probably not in your resume as a section, although you could have teaching jobs in your resume. Same with research. Grants, fellowships, awards, particularly if you're in a science sort of field, those things will be in your CV. Probably not on your resume very much, or as prominently. Because again, somebody is hiring you that asks for a resume, those are not the things that they're going to be interested in about you. So on the resume, a lot of times there'll be a profile, a little opening blurb about you, a couple bullet points about sort of who you are as a potential employee. Frequently, skills, generally never on an academic CV. Lot broader idea of what work experience counts on a resume than on a CV, because again, CVs are very focused on just academic things, resumes, experience from all over. You're trying to impress somebody with your CV or your resume, either one. So like, you know, that when you were in 10th grade and you worked the bowling alley, maybe not going to go on your resume once you've got your PhD or your MFA, but maybe sometimes, you know, sometimes there's not a lot of other experience, unless of course you're applying for a job at a bowling alley, and then it's more relevant and more impressive. Projects, and I know again, people, particularly people who do lab science, a lot of times your work is organized around some big projects. A lot of business and industry is organized around large projects. So that could fit really nicely in your resume, not so much your CV. And I'll just mention this briefly because, again, this is a convention that varies country, place to place. There are some things that just never go on your either one. Marital status, pictures, social security numbers, stuff like that. In some places it's really common, like you send your resume, you put a snapshot with it. No, don't do that. The objective statement to, you know, get a job at whatever company, that's really out of fashion. You don't say references available upon request. If it's a CV, you'll put your references on. If it's a resume, you've got your contact information, they'll get a hold of you. Salary history and requirements, don't. No lies, no damn lies. Statistics, statistics are encouraged on the resume. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. So lies and damn lies, you might have seen this in the Chronicle a couple of days ago. Florida football coach lied on his resume. No longer the Florida football coach. Oops. Don't do that. Somebody will probably check sometimes, and it is generally like legal grounds for dismissal. So even if you've been there a while, if they find a lie in your resume, they can get rid of you, generally. So, all right. So, recap, CVs, long as necessary, credential-based, those academic credentials, no bullets, fairly stable. The resume, a couple of pages, very skill-based, what you can do, what you bring to the company, lots and lots and lots of bullet points, and the adaptable format. So thinking about those differences a little bit. Skipping down to the second half. So being about skills means that your resume is going to include sections on specific skills. It certainly can, at least. It's going to use lots of bullet points with evidence because the people who read it aren't immediately going to understand the significance of some of your things that you've done in your graduate school program. You're going to always try to relate the skills to particular jobs, and you're going to have that broader sense of what's included. So, how are we going to do this? We're going to recast our credentials as skills, we're going to write a lot of bullet points, and we're going to organize the content. So, here we go real quick on how to do these things. So, recasting the credentials as skills. So, and I know Jen already talked about this, so we'll just hit this real quick. The idea behind a transferable skill is that y'all have wicked skills because you're in graduate school. You do all sorts of like hard and amazing things that employers might not understand. So you want to think about this in terms that they will understand, i.e. skills, and then you want to explain to them how your work as a graduate student has given you those skills. So the hard part is sort of breaking apart the stuff you've done. Like, okay, I published this paper, I went to this conference, I did whatever it was in whatever it is those science people do in those science labs. They tell me about it sometimes, and it confuses me. How am I going to break that apart into a skill that an employer would understand? Well, a few different ways. Talk to your friends about what you're good at. And these aren't exclusive. I would try and do them all probably in reverse order here. So talk to your friends, write a list yourself, and look at worksheets, worksheets lists. And there's lots of them out there. And they look like this. This might actually be almost identical to the one Jen showed. And the reason I like to look at these is just to give me an idea, just to get me started thinking about, well, what are the sorts of things that I could say on my resume that somebody in business would be interested in? Project skills, communication skills. I mean, if you've been to a conference, written a paper, you've got communication skills. You just need to explain that to somebody. Decision-making, management, administrative stuff. So you've all got these skills. It's just sort of a question of thinking about how do I start talking about them? How do I stop talking about it in terms that I understand as an academic and start talking about it in terms that people will understand in business or industry? What I would do, I don't think I have it up there. We can, if you contact us, we can send you some lists of these. I've sort of got a folder where I'm collecting these different lists. You can Google graduate student transferable skill list, and you'll find dozens of examples that you can look at. So either way, the idea is that you identify some of them and start thinking about how can I talk about myself in this way. Once you start thinking about your transferable skills, you're like, all right, I've got my transferable skills. Now I've got to get those into bullet points, all right? Because my CV doesn't have any bullet points on it, so I've got to like take those skills and explain it. And this is where writing good bullet points come in. And I've got a few different pieces of advice for this, a couple of different slides here. Generally, what I do when people come into our office, we talk with them, we ask them to send a job ad, and we get out a highlighter and we highlight it. We look for the skills that they mention, the keywords that we know kind of from our field that they have in the job ad. And we get a list of those together, and then we think, all right, in my resume, I'm going to try and hit all of those, as many of those as I can. If they specify certain amounts of time, you know, this many years of experience, I start thinking, what do I have in my past that I can count as that much experience in that particular field? Try and address each of the skills that they have in the job ad in its own bullet point on my resume. And, you know, if you got some leftover space, then think about what other skills do I have that are really good that I should put on there in case they're interested, or what other skills are related to the ones that they want that I'll put on because maybe they hadn't quite thought about it, but they would be impressed by that skill. So the next crucial thing is that good bullet points provide evidence. So everybody can say strong written and oral communication skills. You all researchers, you all know what it means to have evidence. You're not going to trust somebody who makes a claim if they don't give you evidence. An employer is not going to trust you if you give them a claim and don't provide any evidence. So instead of strong communication skills, presented at 6 conferences. There you've got a specific example where they will find that communication skills, or you can do it the second version where you sort of have the skill and then the evidence as well. So that evidence you can quantify. You can tell why it's important. You can say the impact that it had. Oops. Oh shoot. There was going to be another bullet point there, but we're going to move on. Next point, power verbs for your resume. We can send you one of these as well. You can Google power verbs for your resume. You'll find lots of lists. And the idea is just like, it's a mini thesaurus of words that people who read your resume want to hear. So start off your bullet point with one of these. I know a lot of words, but I find this really helpful when I'm looking at these because it just, again, it's like the transferable skill sheet. It just gets me started looking in the right direction. All right. So next. Finally, organizing your resume. This, to me, I think, is one of the most important parts of how to do this, because I think when we think about our resumes, if you've never written one, you probably think about the chronological resume, where you sort of like list all of your jobs, most recent first, most distant last, and then for each job you put 3 or 4 bullet points about your duties and responsibilities. That's one way of doing it. It works nice if you're in a particular industry and you're staying in that industry and you've had jobs in that industry and everything kind of lines up like that. Frequently as graduate students, that's not your experience because you've got academic experience and you've got teaching experience, you've got research experience, you've had some internships and some summer jobs, and you've got all sorts of different stuff. It's not just a linear way, a linear progression. So you need to have a better way of talking about it. And so I'm going to hit on these 2 different ways of organizing your resume, the modified chronological version and the combination. I'll show you examples of these here in a second. I really like the modified chronological. And the idea for this is that you start off with your name, your education, the normal heading stuff. And then you think about skills. Think about it in terms of categories of skills that you have. How do I come up with those categories? I look at the job ad. If they've got 10 requirements in the job ad, I think to myself, how could I put these 10 requirements into like 3 categories of skills that I can say I have, right? So I choose those categories, and those are either skill-based categories or experience-type categories that I'm going to use. And then under each of those categories, I arrange my jobs and my experiences, not just a job, but your jobs and experiences, in chronological order under that. So if one of my categories is transferable skills, communication skills, so I've got a communication skills heading on my resume, and then I've got 2 jobs under it. Teacher at University of Iowa, and then some other experience. And for each of those, I can explain how I got communication skills out of those. Combination works pretty much the same, except you list by job still, but then under each job you have categories of skills. So teacher at the University of Iowa, then communication skills, administrative skills, mentoring and assessment skills, something like that. And I'll show you examples. So here's the chronological one that we'll kind of skip through. If you can read it, it's experience, jobs listed that relate to that experience, and then a little bit of room left over at the bottom for skills. Here's the modified chronological. So broken down into computer and e-business experience, communication and interpersonal experience, organizational and leadership experience. And for each of those, a couple of jobs with a few bullet points. And again, on those bullet points, you're going to do all that stuff, power verbs, quantify, evidence, as much as you can. And if you think about the advantage of this, particularly for you, the employer is looking for particular kinds of skills, and you can say right up front, I've got those skills. I've got all 3 categories of skills that you're looking for. And then you can talk about your PhD research, your TA job, your RA job. You can talk about each of those. In there, they already know that it's communication skills or e-commerce skills or whatever. And then you provide those bullet points to give evidence. So if they're still a little bit skeptical, then you give evidence with quantification that explains why you have those skills based on those jobs that you have. So it can be really it can be a really powerful thing for you. Limitations, it requires a lot of space. If you don't have enough jobs or enough different positions, you can put one job in a couple of different categories, but you don't want both of your jobs in all 3 categories. It starts to look a little redundant. But it's really useful for people who are transferring sort of from one area to another. And then finally, the combination resume. Again, starting with education, work experience. So teaching assistant. I got leadership skills and advising and mentoring skills out of that. So a lot of times, this one will look better if you've got a couple, 3 good jobs that you can put on there and want to pull out specific skills. And again, it lets you highlight the ones that you want. Now, I've said that when you do your resume, you're going to want to target it for each job. But also think about how nicely modular this becomes. You get your bullet points, you get your skills, right? You're applying for a different job and they really stress mentoring and communication. Well, I'm just going to move that one up. Or that's not mentioned on this job at all. I'm going to leave that one out and I'm going to put in a different skill set, right? So you've got a resume, sort of a base resume. You keep modifying that for each job. You just kind of keep a new file for each one. And before long, you've got lots and lots of different opportunities. And it's just a matter of putting the right ones in. Shifting a bullet point around, getting the right categories in. Again, always targeting it really specifically to that job ad. Just a couple final tips. Be clear. It's really easy as academics to use insider jargon that, again, your audience might not understand if they're not insiders. Make it really easy to scan. Don't come up with some wild and new format for your resume. We see these with people have tables and charts in there, and it's oh my God, I don't even know what's going on. You want the employer to be able to look at it and immediately go, oh, I understand exactly what this person's skills are. And there's lots of guides. Don't use a template because other people are using it. It's not going to fit you. It's not going to fit the job ad. It's not going to match up with your skills. But look at those templates and do something similar. Always be consistent in your formatting as you're doing it. Stay focused on the job that you're applying for. Always, 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 always. And make lots of versions. So the joke is if you want 10 opinions on your resume, just give it to 5 people. And it's really true. There's no 100% right way of doing it. It's a creative act. You've got to figure out how your skills are going to be best presented for that particular job, and get feedback on it because you get really narrow and focused on it, and it can be kind of hard to see. The Human Relations Department at the University of Iowa has a checklist for your resume. The very first thing is first impression. Right? The most important thing about your resume is the first impression. So you won't have that after you've been working on it. So show it to your friends. And then the other tip is, of course, come see us if you need help or want us to give a look at it for you. So, all right. Well, thank you.